Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, and thank you for joining us for this Harvard FXB Center webinar on a looming famine, starvation in Gaza. My name is Jacqueline Bhabha. I am on the faculty here at Harvard, and I am pleased to be the moderator for this very important discussion that we're going to have today. I should say that all the views that are going to be expressed are those of the individuals speaking. We don't speak on behalf of the university or the FXB Center. It doesn't really need to be stressed, I think, to this audience, or probably indeed to any audience, how important the issue we're discussing today is. We are over 6 months into a brutal war in the Middle East, a war of unprecedented horror, I think, in many ways. And our FXB Center, Palestine Health and Human Rights Program, has already organized multiple events detailing conditions facing patients, detailing conditions facing children and the suffering of children and families. We've talked about the extraordinary destruction of medical facilities, of people's homes, of businesses, of the possibility of a livelihood. And of course, we, like I'm sure all of you on the call, are acutely aware of the dramatic loss of life and scale of injury in Gaza and in the region. So this is a catastrophic situation which we are really concerned to highlight and to educate ourselves about, particularly as we are a center working on issues to do with health and human rights. No issue could be more pertinent, I think, for our discussion. We have about an hour and a half together, and we have three extremely highly qualified panelists who've kindly agreed to join us. So what I'm going to do is to invite each of them in turn to speak for about 15 minutes or so. I'm then going to ask a couple of questions to each of them and to the panel, and to invite them to dialogue with each other on points that arise. And I'm going to try and make sure that we have at least 20 or 30 minutes for questions and comments before we close this webinar. So let me start by introducing Professor Alex de Waal, who is going to be our first speaker. Alex is the Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation, and he is one of the foremost experts on Sudan, but also on many of the recent crises in sub-Saharan Africa. He has written extensively on humanitarian crises, on issues of human rights, particularly in the African context, but also issues of governance, and he's worked on a whole range of relevant topics. He's on this panel with us because some years ago he wrote a book about famine, and he talked about the ways in which famine is used not just as a kind of tragedy that we have to respond to, but as a tool of war and as a tool of attack. And his comments and his thinking about famine have actually been really influential. And I think we're now seeing with dramatic clarity how foresighted his interest in this topic is. So let me just, without further ado, give you the mic, Alex, and thank you again so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you for organising this, which is a very timely issue. I'd started my academic career studying famine, and some 10 years ago or so, I really anticipated that this would be only of historical interest. I thought this was a problem that had been largely resolved. Unfortunately, it's not the case. What I'd like to do is to provide some sort of comparative metrics so that we know where Gaza fits within the overall sort of universe of famines. Now, until about 20 years ago, there was no accepted definition or metrics for defining and measuring famine. There was just a sort of informal understanding that a famine was an occasion, a terrible occasion on which acute malnutrition became so extreme and so widespread due to people failing to access food, not necessarily there not being enough food, but simply failing to access food, that it caused excess mortality. And then about 20 years ago, a number of the food security specialists or emergency food security specialists got together with the UN and humanitarian agencies and said, we need a standardized metric. And the first metrics had 3 dimensions to them. So there was magnitude, the number of people affected, the numbers of people dying. Now that isn't terribly useful for preventing famine or intervening. You don't want to have to wait until 100,000 people have died and to say that's a famine. But it's still an important metric. And in the biggest famine that we have today is Sudan, where some 15 million people or so are in what I'll shortly describe as emergency situation. Another is duration, how long a society is in this crisis. And the worst cases are South Sudan, Yemen, Democratic Republic of Congo, which have been in all those cases up to a decade in a state of humanitarian emergency. But then the key metric that was developed, which became what's called the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System, the IPC, is about intensity, severity, how bad it is in a particular area. And this is a 5-point scale, right? And it's very intuitive and color coded. So you have green, which is normal, yellow, which is stressed. Phase 3 is sort of orangey brown, which is crisis. Phase 4, emergency, which is red on the maps. And phase 5, catastrophe or famine, which is a sort of blood red. Now, when these scales were being developed, in fact, most of the academics who studied this said, let's declare famine at 3, phase 3. The reason being that this is when children begin to die. This is when we begin to have excess mortality through malnutrition. And also because it's only when you start talking about famine that people respond. But actually the decision was made by consensus at the end of the day that it was only phase 5 when we get really extreme conditions of excess deaths of 2 per 10,000 per day or more, combined with extreme food crisis at a household level. People simply can't find what they need to survive. And we have very high levels of child malnutrition. So
Alex,
the original
could I just interrupt you? Could you just explain what you mean by 2 per 10,000 per day?
That means that a population is in a crisis level, so that you actually have a level of excess death that is several times what would be normal. And about half to 2/3 of those will be children under 5. So you actually have to get to, under the current definition of famine, you actually have to be deep into a crisis. And in many of the emergencies that we've had today, for instance, Yemen or South Sudan, you have large populations in emergency. And over the years, hundreds of thousands of people, that is children, die without that famine threshold being crossed. So let's not get too fixated on that threshold. It was a threshold that many of us wanted to call not famine, but extreme famine. So where does Gaza fit in this? Well, Gaza is a famine. It's not the biggest famine. It's not the longest famine, but it is the most intense famine that we have seen since records began. And those records, those well-calibrated records are only 20 years old, but we can infer from previous experience that there really hasn't been anything like this for 75 years. So let me explain. Back before October, the level of child malnutrition in Gaza was 1% or less, which actually has an interesting consequence that Palestinian medics, however skilled they may be, did not have experience of treating severe acute malnutrition among children, not in diagnosing and treating it. They need to be trained to do this. You can't just offload food from the back of trucks and expect that these desperately ill children will be able to recover. They need specialized training. Anyway, so less than 1%. We're now at a rate in northern Gaza estimated at 30%. Now, if you take the malnutrition surveys from Somalia and South Sudan at the height of their crises, 177 surveys, only 8 surveys have that level of malnutrition of 30% or above. So that's extraordinarily bad. If you look at the numbers who are in the different IPC scales, we've never seen anything like this before. The estimate as of just over a month ago was that 96% of the Gazan population, 2.2 million people, were in phases 3, the great majority being in phases 4 or 5. We've never seen this before. The sheer number in IPC phase 5, which is catastrophe or famine, which back in March was estimated at somewhere in 650 to 700,000. The one case which is comparable to this is Somalia 2011, when about 490,000 people were in IPC stage 5. So we're already worse in absolute numbers than Somalia at a famine that killed 250,000 people some 13 years ago, the worst famine up to now recorded for this century. And the figures that are estimated are that those are going to get much, much worse. So the trajectory is extraordinarily bad. I call this famine. If this is not famine, then the word really has no meaning. So let me add 2 more points before concluding this, these sort of introductory remarks, and we can come back to some of them. Actually, 3 points. One is that famine is not just the aggregate of individual malnutrition. It's also a social phenomenon. It is, one of my legal colleagues, Tom Dannenbaum, calls it societal torture. And actually, this was how I, in my field work in famine back in the 1980s, this is how I envisaged it. As more than loss of life, it was the loss of a way of life. The humiliation, the breaking of social ties, the taboos being broken. That is, I think, tremendously important and has in many ways a greater impact on a society than the number of deaths. The second is that all modern famines are man-made, gendered language, deliberate. And this is a case in point. This is a case in which there was absolutely no reason for this famine, this mass starvation to have occurred other than political military action by the authorities. Now, obviously, Hamas is culpable too, but the overwhelming actions of the war crime of starvation, which is destruction of objects indispensable to survival, creating conditions under which human life is impossible, that responsibility falls on the government of Israel, just as every other famine in modern time has been the outcome of political and military action. This is, I think, a very severe case. It exceeds in scale the starvation sieges that we saw in Syria. And I think as we begin to make those comparisons, we begin to become aware of the gravity of the crisis. 2 final points. There's a lot of attention to the obstruction of humanitarian aid. That's very important. It is not the primary reason why Gazans are starving. It is the secondary reason. Just one statistic. In 2022, 116 humanitarian aid workers were killed worldwide in the course of their duties. In 6 months in Gaza, 300 have died. And then the last point, and perhaps we can come back to this, is I think the Gaza case is very significant because the gravamen of South Africa's case, and I'm speaking to you from Johannesburg, where I'm involved in a number of activities here in South Africa. The gravamen of the South African case between the International Court of Justice, especially in the additional provisional measures that were requested last month, rests on the fact that Gazans are starving in a famine. And I think, and I'd like us to be able to discuss that point a little bit in our conversation as we go forward.
Alex, thank you very much indeed. I wonder if I could just ask you one follow-up question, which is, you said the obstruction of humanitarian aid is a very serious issue, but it's not the main issue. So what is the main issue?
The main issue is the destruction of what is indispensable for a population to survive. So, and the war crime of starvation is not defined around food alone. It is anything indispensable for survival. So that would be a water system, that would be a health system, that would be a power system so that people can get electricity, can cook food, maternal care for children, all these things. And actually, in almost all recorded famines, it's actually the diseases, the infectious diseases that are caused, that are unleashed by the destruction and the displacement of people that are at least as lethal as starvation itself. So when you see those desperately thin children who are wasting away, it is a combination of factors. It is their malnutrition, their depressed immune systems, their exposure to diseases that occur because they are in a desperately unhealthy environment, dehydration. And as Gaza moves into summer, that is going to be even accentuated now. And so the idea that you can simply solve this problem by bringing in more trucks of food, let alone by airdrops, which is just a joke, is something that we need to get our minds around, something much, much more comprehensive in terms of restoring basic ways on which people can live a healthy life are absolutely essential. Obstructing aid is critically important, particularly in these circumstances, but it is, as it were, the secondary problem, or indeed the secondary crime.
Thank you so much. I'm sure we'll come back to some of these points. So our second panelist is Michael Fakhri, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, also a professor at University of Oregon School of Law. And Michael has a background in law development and issues related to food resiliency. He has multiple degrees, including a master's from our law school, a bachelor's from Queen's University, and degrees from Toronto. And I think, Michael, if you could start off perhaps by explaining to us, because not everybody in the audience might be familiar with your UN position, what does it mean to be a UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food? And perhaps explain to us a little bit about where the right to food comes from in kind of the human rights normative framework, and then, go on to make your comments again for about 15 minutes, please. And again, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie, and thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's really also a pleasure to be speaking with Alex and with Georgios today. So a UN Special Rapporteur in general terms is someone who is a volunteer who holds a particular mandate. In my case, the mandate is the right to food. So my mandate comes from the Human Rights Council. I'm a volunteer. I'm not the UN. I'm an independent expert. And one way to think about the job is I'm the eyes, ears, and sometimes good conscience for the UN system on all matters regarding hunger, malnutrition, and famine from a human rights perspective. And as the title suggests, my job is to report. It's to share and understand what's going on in different parts of the world, to share that information not only directly to the Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly, but I also see part of my job is to learn and to listen from different communities and to share what I'm hearing and what I'm learning from people all over the world. So my job is to talk to everybody. I talk to ministers, to diplomats, to peasants, to labor unions, to activists, to social movement leaders. And I keep sharing from what I hear and what I'm learning. And the right to food is interesting in that in some ways it's one of the least controversial human rights. You don't have to explain that food, like water, like shelter, is a human right just in sort of an intuitive way. Then the question arises, well, what does it actually mean, and how does one implement it, and that sort of thing. And when the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, in 2020, depending on how you measure things, by March 2020, the whole world was in lockdown. That immediately triggered a food crisis. I had started my mandate in May 2020. And what that highlighted, what many people had been saying for a long time, is that our food system, meaning all the ways that we make and grow and share food and eat food, there's something really wrong in most people's food systems, in that it creates all of 1/3 of the world's greenhouse gases, and most importantly, it actually is not preventing hunger. And I would argue our food systems create violence that actually create the conditions of hunger. So one of the definitions of the right to food from the International Covenant of Economic and Social Cultural Rights is freedom from hunger. And I really like the fact that the word freedom is there. What that means is one has to ask, well, freedom from what? What's causing hunger? It's freedom from oppression, exploitation, and occupation. And to build on Alex's point, just like he said, famine is always man-made, and he was very specific in his gendered language. I think exactly, like, gender-based violence is a significant issue in food systems. But I would broaden it even more to say hunger is always the result of political choices and institutional design. So just like we saw that in the pandemic, and I had written a report that I presented to the General Assembly in 2021, I believe, and the conclusion of my report is we're going to see more violence in our food systems. The argument was our food systems are producing violence in the form of gender-based violence, violence against workers, violence against nature. We're going to see more violence.
Interrupt you for a second.
Yeah.
Could you just say, why are our food systems, explain what you mean by our food systems are producing gender-based violence? Could you just explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I'll just start with the very everyday. If you go to a restaurant, any restaurant, whether it's fast food or high-end or whatever, there's a good chance that in the kitchen, there's some degree of sexual harassment or some rate of sexual assault, and that the business model rests on that exploitation and that power imbalance. If you eat any fruit or vegetable in the United States, North America, or almost anywhere in the world, there's a good chance that the worker that was either picking that fruit and vegetable or processing it in some sort of distribution center is a survivor of some degree of gender-based violence. And again, the business model being that by exploiting and putting people and forcing people into these situations, that power imbalance allows the employer to pay them less, to provide less benefits, much less actually causing harm, right, to that person. So our economic model and there's very little accountability. The mechanisms of accountability are not strong enough, and that reflects a broader political system in which we know what's going on, and yet little is done to prevent it or to help survivors fight back and fight against it, right? So it's sort of built into the system. And that also is to say that to change it is not just change this policy here or change a law there, but it requires a significant recalibration of power, putting more power in the hands of people, of women, of workers, of peasants, of the people that make our food usually. And so that's what that describes. What I did, so in my report, I was saying, we should expect more violence on our food systems, but I did not anticipate what we're seeing in Gaza. And within 2 weeks, I believe, of when the war, I mean, to call it a war, let me take a step back. Hamas attacked Israeli citizens on October 7th. And they targeted civilians which is a war crime. On October 8th, on October 9th, Israel declared its starvation campaign openly. They said they're going to impose a total siege in Gaza. And within 2 weeks, myself, amongst other mandate holders who focus on water, housing, health, and internally displaced people, immediately recognized the signs of a risk of genocide. And we immediately put out a statement saying there's a risk of genocide based on the fact that Israel has announced total siege and a starvation campaign, has implemented such a campaign, and is using dehumanizing language against the Palestinian people. And as we're seeing, unfortunately, both in terms of facts, context, and international legal processes, there is a genocide unfolding. So, when Alex was describing the situation in Gaza as the worst, most intense famine in the last 75 years, one has to ask the question, how did this happen? What were the conditions that enabled this to happen? And the reason this is, again, Israel has had so much power over the lives of Palestinian people broadly. So before this war, there was a siege in Gaza for 17 years, where Israel calibrated the amount of food that was allowed in, just enough to not raise any humanitarian alarms. And people were sort of in a precarious emergency on the brink of starvation for 17 years. They counted calories of what was going into Gaza. But even before that, Israel was controlling the conditions of life in not just in Gaza, to all Palestinian people. So when you look at food and you look at the fact that everyone has the right to food, everyone has the right to access good food being food that is nutritious, that makes you strong and healthy, that is also culturally appropriate. We define who we are as a people through our food. That is one way we express our relationships to each other. It's the way we express our relationships with nature. It's existential. So Israel now is not only restricting humanitarian aid, bombarding humanitarian convoys. Over 20 convoys have been bombarded at least. Israel's not only shooting civilians that are seeking aid, it's destroying the food system in Gaza. It's destroying agricultural land. It's destroyed fishing boats. It's destroying the Palestinian people's ability to feed themselves now, and it's making it almost impossible for Palestinian people to feed themselves into the future. The way you access food is either by working the land, by fishing, by hunting, and through markets, fair, stable markets. And that has been obliterated in Gaza. Focusing on food also tells us another thing. It's not just a war in Gaza. This is the continuation of an attack against the Palestinian people. We've seen record numbers of violence against Palestinian people in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem in the form of Israeli settlers supported by Israeli military forces attacking peasants and disallowing them, making it virtually impossible for them to harvest. One example is olives. So if a Palestinian farmer can't harvest olives, yes, it's a source of livelihood. Yes, olives are a source of food. But the olive tree, which lives for 100 years, is also one core element of Palestinian identity. It is to deny Palestinians their relationship with their ancestors, with their land, and with their future. And we saw when there were unfounded allegations against employees of the UN, the main UN agency that provides humanitarian relief to Palestinian refugees. This is UNRWA. Israel said, oh, there's 8 employees. They work with Hamas. They didn't provide any evidence whatsoever. That same day, the major funders of UNRWA cut funding to the whole agency, which the result is this. The allegations, again, which were unsubstantiated, were against 8 employees amongst 30,000 employees. And it affected Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the West Bank and Gaza. This was collective punishment. So this made their access to food unstable, their access to water, housing, and education unstable. So when you look at people's access to food as a people, And you see what we see immediately, that again, this is not just a war in Gaza. This is an attack against the very existence of the Palestinian people as such, which is why we're framing it, the issue as genocide. What's curious to me is why there has been political hesitation by UN leaders, and why some countries are saying there's no genocide. Israel has said it. So whenever I'm interviewed in the media, they're like, how do you know Israel had the intent to starve the Palestinian people? How do you know it's genocide? And my answer is, Israel said so. They said so repeatedly, time and time again. Then they implemented this plan, and now we're seeing the effects. Now we're seeing the effects, which Alex described, which I have no doubt we'll hear more from Georgios. So what's also interesting to me is the mass mobilization that people have organized themselves in reaction to this. So we are witnessing a genocide in our time. We are witnessing the worst starvation, the most intense starvation campaign in 75 years. It's going to get worse, not just for Palestinian people. If we keep allowing for this violence to continue, as we're seeing in South Sudan, we're going to see more instances of genocide, more instances of starvation. The fact that millions of people around the world have mobilized, not just against the war, but to support and to fight for the Palestinian people's basic right to self-determination, is actually the force that's going to create change, that's going to create the structural change necessary. And so what we see now with student protests in campuses across the United States, they are part of this global movement. And because the United States is one of the main military and financial supporters of Israel, the United States is complicit in genocide and starvation. What we're seeing then with students is the students in US campuses and now campuses around the world, but specifically in the United States, are leading. They are leaders in the United States against genocide, against starvation, in favor of everybody's human rights. And that's where I'm hopeful of where we're going to see change into the future. Thank you.
Michael, thank you so much. I wonder if I could follow up with one question. I think you may be the only lawyer on our panel, apart from me. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about what the legal remedies, as you see them, might be. I heard very clearly what you just said about social change coming and the important role of student activism, which we're seeing, and the role of young people generally, I think, not only students across the world in protesting. But from a legal perspective, both Alex and you have talked about war crimes. You've talked about genocide. I'm sure we'll hear more from Georgios about, the humanitarian calamity on the ground. What are the legal remedies available to hold Israel to account, maybe to hold the US to account, to hold Hamas to account, to hold individual people who are willfully or deliberately killing civilians and babies to account? What tools do we have?
Thank you, Jackie. I mean, what we're seeing is how we frame this in legal terms, to your point, highlights the remedies, and highlights the meaning. Like, what does this all mean? Which is really the challenge when we're sort of faced with such horror. To say that it is a war crime, the remedy would be to hold individuals accountable, either through the International Criminal Court, through the creation of an ad hoc tribunal like we saw in Rwanda or Yugoslavia, or national courts, through criminal proceedings nationally. However, by highlighting and framing the situation as genocide means we can hold entire states accountable. And I think that's important. In my mind, genocide is not the crime of crimes. How we describe atrocities and horror matters. Let's not create a hierarchy of horrors. What it does, to your point, Jackie, in the question, is it highlights the particular remedy. So the remedy in international criminal proceedings, or criminal proceedings specifically, is put a person in jail. So that implies that to prevent the crime, that putting someone in jail will prevent, but will be a preventative measure. But as we know from criminology and from experience, that criminal law is not a very good tool to prevent crimes from happening. It is a form of punishment, sure. What's the remedy for genocide where a state is held accountable? In this instance, State of Israel and its allies are culpable. It highlights the systemic nature, that this doesn't happen overnight, that isn't just the choice of this individual or that individual. In the case of food, it means it is a destruction of a food system over years. It is the slow violence. So human rights raises the alarm before we're in any form of acute emergency or famine or whatever. It shows us that in the case of the Palestinian people, this has been going on for 75 years. What we're talking about is 75 years of dispossession of land, occupation of land, and continued oppression and exploitation, along with occupation, of course. So we've had 75 years in the UN system of seeing the slow violence and gradual, consistent dispossession that led to this moment. That's what genocide highlights. And the remedy, more specifically to your question, is recognizing, respecting, fulfilling the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. That is their right to exist and express who they are, and to recognize that is inherently connected to their territory. So genocide, in my mind, it's not like it's the crime of crimes, it's the worst. There are all these horrors and there's all these different ways we frame it. Genocide actually clarifies what's at stake, what's the cause, and the remedy then becomes, it's the State of Israel, it's the long-standing structural relationship with the United States and Germany and others.
Thank you so much, Michael. So just to kind of paraphrase your very full and useful answer, because I think many of our audience and our listeners are non-lawyers. There are kind of two remedies we're talking about. There's the individual remedy, which the International Criminal Court, for example, can deliver to particular individuals in the Israeli IDF, in Hamas, whatever. And then there's the more political state-level remedy, which is what the International Court of Justice is dealing with in the genocide case, which is really looking, as you said, at the structural issues. So the two things are complementary. They're two different pathways, in a way, to securing some form of legal remedy here for the situation. Okay, thank you so much. So let's move on to our third panelist. And I'm very grateful to Georgios Petropoulos for joining us. Georgios is the head of the Gaza Sub-Office of the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, otherwise known as OCHA. And he is coordinating humanitarian action in Gaza, and he's reporting, I think, or joining us from Gaza. So, Georgios, I'm incredibly grateful to you for taking time out to join us. We are really anxious to hear from you from the front lines about how you see the unfolding of this, particularly this famine and the impact on the survival of people around you, and how your agency and others, other humanitarians involved, are managing to engage. So again, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and thank you for having me. Just to check that you can hear me. Yeah. All right. Thanks. So yes, hello from Han Yunis, the coast here on the Mediterranean Sea, from Gaza. On behalf of everyone that works here, I'd like to thank you for inviting me, and I'd like to also thank Alex, for paying tribute to the lives that we've lost, the humanitarian workers, of course, but most importantly of all, the almost 35,000 Palestinians that have died, and dozens of thousands of people who are injured, and another dozen or so thousand people who are still missing under the rubble. I've been in aid for about 20 years. I think visually, what we see here every day in Gaza is incomparable to anything else I've ever seen. Our office, OCHA, it's a clunky name, but you did really well with it. We do a few things for this system. The first is to coordinate the planning that we do around what we say this is what we have to do in this response. Very importantly, for the Gaza humanitarian system, we are the link between the civil military, as we say. We talk to both sides basically in any conflict, and very much our dialogue here is with the Israeli military, trying to open both Gaza to things coming into Gaza, and trying to open up Gaza to things moving throughout the Strip from north to south and from south to north. We also deal with information management. We get these numbers out that everyone uses. We're a quotable entity. So we make sure that these numbers are verified, and that can sometimes be slow and painful. We also raise money and do advocacy for this response. And for me, this is a very powerful opportunity. So again, I'm very grateful. I think just to start with, the war in its most modern sense, I think, which is what I've worked in for most of my life in conflict zones, aid workers meet people in need outside battle zones. People in need usually are able to flee. They're either displaced or they become refugees. And then we go to them where they are, and we meet them. We give them what they need, from food and water to cash response, to mental health, to any kind of clusterized or direct response that they need, whether it's to gender-based violence, to a systemic issue, or climate shock. But it's never really done on top of an acute conflict. It's done next to it. Even in places like Darfur or Ukraine, we don't have to cross front lines to the extent that we do here, or coexist with a live battle. So, just today, as I'm talking to you, I have colleagues who are waiting at the checkpoint to go from south to north, and there are rockets being fired about 200 meters to their right and shells landing about 100 meters to their left. In something that is not done anywhere else.
Could you just explain to us, when you say from north to south, is there an actual barrier that divides the country in two? I'm sorry for the ignorance.
I'll come to that. So there is a bisection of the Strip, which is basically an Israeli military road on which there are two checkpoints which have to be passed if you want to take anything north to south. These are lightning rods for attacks, and they are very, very complicated in very sensitive areas. And as my colleague said before, essentially you've always had a controlled, for the last years, you've had a controlled environment in Gaza. It's not a demand and supply. It's been subject to things being allowed to come in. And that is still what we have here. So the best way that I've heard this conflict be alluded to is that it is absurd and punitive. And we see that in every single rule and negotiation that we have to make for how accessibility to people in need here is. It's either going to be not normative, and so you're talking about whether a kit for children, which has orange juice, is not allowed in because orange juice should not be given to populations that hold hostages. We've heard that. We've seen that some little boots for children looked too much like combat boots, so that was not allowed in. And that's sort of the absurdity part of it. The punitive part of it comes where I would agree with what was said earlier, where when you drive through Gaza, you see that the trappings, I would say, the trappings of civilization, what you would look around you and ignore in other places, a cement truck, a pole for lights on the road, those are systematically destroyed. And clearly they are destroyed not by an explosion, but by a bulldozer, or an APC, an armored personnel carrier, or a tank that has actually deliberately rendered it inoperative or useless for its intended function, which has, to you and I, a banal part of our neighborhood and our city. But these are the things that you need to have an urban society, to have millions of people live next to each other. It's been 7 months, and in those 7 months, Gaza Strip, which had 5 to 550 trucks a day come in before the war, has survived with, at times, no trucks. We started with 0 trucks a day coming in with anything. We're now at about 190, 170. But those are trucks shared between a humanitarian system and what is given to for the Gaza Strip. We've heard about the Looming overview, what the people in Gaza have to deal with. First of all, there is no cash really left in Gaza. So even if you bring in a commercial system, people cannot afford to purchase it because they simply have no cash. There are literally banknotes that are rotting because there's no recycling of a banking system to recycle the banknotes. The food that comes in is not always nutritious food. It's not that there are vegetables all over the place. It's canned beans, and it's long life kind of food, which cannot sustain you and certainly supports the malnutrition that we see. And of course, the people of Gaza that already had, I think there's some statistics that you can see that the resilience had already been degraded. There was massive poverty here, and more than 400,000 people in Gaza had mental health issues that they were medicated for before October 7th. So that's more than 400,000 people that had already an issue with mental health from all of the issues that Gaza has had before this war. If you are a 10-year-old child, UNICEF says here, you are now living your fourth escalation, and essentially the fourth escalation is a full-blown war. But this time, not only do you have very little access to trauma support, every single person who is supposed to help you through this trauma here in the Gaza Strip is also traumatized with you. The availability of water supply in Gaza, which is very much based around a modern urban society here that we had, is based on fuel pumps and fuel. We have 5% of the original water supply left. We're trying very hard not to bring in bottled water. It would take $200 a day just to bring in bottled water. The environmental catastrophe would be insane. And we are still surviving simply with this 5%. But it's enough to maybe drink for most people, but not necessary for the hygiene and sanitation that you need. And that also then under supports the increasing malnutrition that we see. The levels of malnutrition, the percentages that we hear, the global acute malnutrition, the severe acute malnutrition. I'm not a technical food specialist or nutritionist. These are in the percentages that I have never seen in my work. And here we get now again back to the punitive nature and the absurdity. When the IPC report came out, the first engagement we had with the Israeli government was, well, we need to bring more food. And the food was in the form of flour. And that's when we were able to actually have a conversation around what you heard earlier from Alex, that to be healthy and to have a nutritious lifestyle, to not be malnourished, to not be hungry, you need a safe home, you need food, water, you need a safe family space. You can go to the extent that you say that you need a balanced and happy parents. You need to remove trauma, and you need to protect the children. You also need a functioning health system. So although there was 1% malnutrition here, if someone was diagnosed with malnutrition, they would go to the hospital and they would be treated, even if it was acute malnutrition, even if it was malnutrition with other diseases. There is no functioning health system anymore in Gaza. We have here and there 1 or 2 hospitals. We have one north of these checkpoints. There is only one place where a child can receive treatment for acute, therapeutic malnutrition, meaning, it's malnutrition. You're so hungry, you're so sick from it that you have to be put in a hospital and treated there. On the south side, where I am, there are 2 locations, but we used to have 36 hospitals in Gaza giving some of the world's top-notch treatment, from plastic surgery to chronic illnesses. We are now seeing what may happen not only with an IPC5 looming famine, but then what we're seeing is basically the risk that we have famine on top of a physical garbage dump. We don't have any more landfills left, and the landfills that we could use, we have no access to. So this is where we come in to try to negotiate this. In addition to this, and then moving a little bit on to issues about an occupying power and the responsibility, I'd like to underline that in many wars or many invasions, or when an army takes over a piece of land, they stay and create a new system. I mean, it's still an occupation, but they are responsible for the people and the land that they've taken. When the Israeli military comes in here, there's an incursion and destruction. There's loss of life. There's evacuation of civilians, and profound destruction of homes and businesses. If you drive around Gaza City, there are no sidewalks or tarmac. They are bulldozed. They look like sand dunes. We've gone down to sand. I think the only thing missing would be to salt the roads, which means that the responsibility then to give dignity and health and survivability to the occupied population is missing from this conflict, and it rests on the
Georgios, we're having difficulty hearing you. I wonder if you would mind just turning
humanitarian
off
system, which is not enabled, and it isn't.
Georgios, can you hear me? I wondered if you might be able to turn off your
on top
video.
of that, this is so there's also yes. Is it better? Can you hear me now?
Thank you. Much better.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah. So, I was saying that basically, because there's no love lost, there's also accusations of collusion and division, where is the going. So a lot of the member states that would normally fund a classic humanitarian response are very hesitant, and this is where you get into the accusations with UNRWA, without which really there would be no functional system here. Without an occupying power's permanent presence to guarantee some security and civil order, we don't have any rule of law left in Gaza. Humanitarians are not armed to protect themselves. We are not police force. There's no peacekeeping force here. There's nothing. It is simply, well-natured, good-meaning people and organizations, including the UN, that try to bring in, a few sectors of aid. We are doing what we can with what we have, and we have negotiated, as you've seen in the last few weeks, new crossings to open and new abilities to aid. Now, for North Gaza, north of this checkpoint, where we saw and heard so much on the integrated phase classification report, I can say that in the last few weeks, we have seen anecdotally and visually a better situation on the streets. So when I drive there, I'm no longer accosted by people for food. They actually ask for cigarettes. There is more food available. But that does not mean that you're averting a famine catastrophe, because you've lost the ability now, with this breakdown in the social order, with this breakdown of systems and resilience, to actually meaningfully impact those who would be most vulnerable to this lack of food, who are already starving. And I think the most profound exchange I've had with a member of the Israeli military is they asked me, well, when you go there, can you see the people that are hungry? And I said, look, that's not how it works. I think a lot of the people who are dying of hunger are doing it at home. And the people who are out asking for food are the remaining physically strong, active members, usually young men of this neighborhood, of this family, who have gone out, putting their life in danger to try to find food that's left somewhere. So this was a few weeks ago. Now we're busy kind of standing up hospitals and healthcare again. But again, we are asking for more fuel. Again, we are asking for more time. And certainly, and I'll end here, Jacqueline, we're saying that yet another incursion or invasion, essentially, to the southern governorate of Rafah, with 600,000 to 800,000 people displacing once again north to Khan Yunis, which is essentially an eviscerated city itself, will mean the end not only of the humanitarian system we've been able to set up here, but will spell, I think, doom for hundreds, if not thousands, of people, as they have to displace, sometimes for the 7th or 8th time. If you're in the street here, I think the misery and the panic are evident, and I really hope every day that a ceasefire and the negotiations see not only the end of this war, but also the
Georgios, thank you so much. Maybe you can put your screen back on again and see if we can communicate. But thank you so much. I wanted to ask you a follow-up question, which is And again, this may be a very naive question, but in other conflicts where it's been impossible for people who need, oh, have we lost you? Maybe we've lost Georgios altogether. You know what? I'm going to reserve that
Sorry.
question. Oh, you're here. Okay, good. I couldn't see you. I wanted to ask you, in other conflicts, when we've seen people who desperately need medical treatment and can't get it, we've seen people being airlifted to other countries. We've seen people being taken to, countries who can provide medical care. From what you say, children who are, facing starvation have no access to appropriate medical care, or very, very inadequate access. Why is there no effort to airlift these children to a place where they might get treatment and have their lives saved?
A very minimal ability to medically evacuate people from Gaza exists. It is unfortunately not keeping up with the need. There are almost 10,000 patients, including children, who need to be evacuated. It is a very complicated process. It includes, again, back to absurdity, things like if you have a toddler with, let's say, a congenital disease that needs a type of healthcare not available in Gaza anymore. If the parents, especially if the father is of fighting age, they cannot accompany the child outside. So you have an unaccompanied minor now go into another country for aid. If a child is dying of malnutrition and needs extensive, a higher level of care, the World Health Organization counts that on average it takes 7 days to evacuate this child from Gaza. For all intents and purposes, if you are Palestinian in Gaza and you have a chronic illness, forget if you have massive trauma from the war, you are in more likelihood going to die now. The director of health services that I spoke to said, God forbid you have an issue that requires dialysis. You are destined to die slowly, and we will not be able to give you the amount of that kind of healthcare that you need. There are no CT scanners left. There is one MRI machine left. There are no spare parts. There's no ability to import these machines. There's no fuel left to run the generators that run them. And that means if you have no CT scanners and MRI, imagine in a place where you have explosions and gunshot and trauma, you do need to medically evacuate. Now, the story is a little bit different if you're a foreigner. If something were to happen to me, for example, it would be a much different story on the casualty and medical evacuation. But unfortunately for the victims of this war, in their thousands, that door is closed for the most part to all but a very, very few. My colleagues, when they come from East Jerusalem, when they come in from Egypt, we don't come without a few plastic bags of, oncology, cancer medicine from doctor to doctor, or, our former humanitarian coordinator would come in from East Jerusalem, and someone would literally give him medicine for a specific young child that had had a liver transplant, and without these it could not survive. And they were handed hand to hand from UN officials, and then I'd give it to a colleague who would be going to this hospital the next day. And I think I was very happy to do that, but that is no way. That is no way to survive. That's no way to afford dignity to people, and that is no way to sustain a future for children.
Thank you so much. I wonder if I could just ask you one other follow-up question, and then I'll ask Alex and Michael to come back on, and we can have a panel discussion before dealing with the questions from the audience. So the other question I want to ask you, Georgios, is you said that, I thought it was a very good, interesting point, that normally humanitarians are not in the fray of conflict, and the laws of war protect humanitarians and are meant to protect humanitarian actors. We can see you are clearly labeled. Why is it continually so difficult? Is this, in your opinion, instructions that are coming from the highest levels of the Israeli military to obstruct humanitarians on purpose? Is it negligence? I mean, how do you explain this gross, visible dereliction of the basic laws of war? Georgios, have we lost?
I actually have to explain that. We sustain, guarantee, and run. Yes, we sustain, guarantee, and run the humanitarian notification system with the Israeli military, where we tell them static sites, the guest houses and office, and the convoys that run. So it is the most deadly conflict to humanitarians, I think, well, I know in the history of recent modern aid. It is probably a calculation between lack of disregard, lack of accountability, and a healthy dose of lack of discipline on the ground. It is a very violent fight. There are zones where there are free exchanges of crossfire. And there is also something to be said about the great proportion of aid workers who have been killed who are actually Palestinian. I think with the exception of 5, most of the almost 300 colleagues that we have lost are Palestinian. They're not just killed, but Palestinian United Nations are all arbitrarily detained when crossing checkpoints. We don't know where they are. All of these are illegal. These are violations of humanitarian law, or what you would call the laws of war. And if you do this long enough, the aid system will censor itself, will not sustain itself, and has no way to protect itself. So parties to the conflict, member states, countries hosting civil wars or international conflicts must and are obligated to protect humanitarian workers and civilians and protected sites like hospitals and schools and UN sites, which host hundreds of thousands of displaced Palestinians at present and are continuously targeted.
Thank you so much. So I wondered if our other two panelists could now maybe come back on again. Thank you. And Alex and Michael, you know, Georgios mentioned some incredible kind of situations on the ground. Let me put my video on, sorry. Incredible, this idea that there's one hospital in the northern half of the country with very minimal capacity, the idea that there is absolutely no cash economy at all. As you look forward, irrespective of what happens with the ceasefire, but just with where we are now, with this place which is rubble, and with this population which is so severely debilitated, what do you see? Maybe start with you, Alex. You know, you talked about, you know, how famine is when the necessities of life are destroyed. What do you see, and what is, maybe you can just say what is the best case scenario we can hope for going forward in the next, say, 6 months?
Well, let me actually jump further into the future and make 2 points. One is that what we know from studies of famines such as the Dutch hunger winter of 1944-45 is that the effects of severe malnutrition on children, including unborn children, are lifelong and actually intergenerational. A young girl who suffers severe malnutrition at a very young age will have children who are shorter, less healthy, less cognitively capable than their peers. So there's a second, the effects of this will be felt biologically, physically, for generations. A second point is that if you think of great famines in the past, like the famine in Ireland in the 1840s or the Holodomor in Ukraine, it has been several generations before the societies that have undergone this have been ready to confront it. And the reason for that is the loss of dignity, the sense of humiliation that goes with the experience of starvation. So that, and just to give one example, imagine if you are the mother of some children and you have some food which you can prepare for your own children, and yet your neighbors are at your door or at the door of your tent who are in an even worse state, and you refuse them the food. That is what stays in people's minds, that petty cruelty, that gray zone, when the descriptions of hunger in the concentration camps, Primo Levi and so on, or of the people who have undergone starvation in Cambodia, fighting over having a spoon, because that is the difference between living and dying. And this is what people remember, not the fact that this huge crime was inflicted upon them by a remote government or army or something. And so that trauma, which is a psychological trauma, but also a social trauma, will be with this society for a long time, for generations. And so I think it's very important, and this is slightly going off your question, it's very important as a sort of act of emancipation that when justice is done, this isn't so much a matter of individual justice through the courts, but the transitional justice, the truth-telling, the memorialization, the coming to terms with this experience is hugely important. And it has to start now. Let me leave it at that, as I don't want to.
Alex, let me just ask you a follow-up question, which is, it's obvious that the truth-telling and the reckoning will place Israel at the center of the stage. But how else would you think about this politically in terms of other parties who should be considered responsible when we come to have this kind of truth-telling and this reckoning in the future? How broadly would you kind of consider the collective responsibility for this massive crime that we're seeing unfolding, set of crimes?
Well, a couple of points. First of all, of course, Hamas is not innocent in this. Hamas has behaved atrociously and continues to do so, and we should not overlook that. But I think the other party to this that needs to be very reflective and candid is the United States. The US has championed a whole series of international regulations, including, for example, the UN Security Council Resolution 2417 on armed conflict and hunger, which was heralded by the United States as a step forward in preventing man-made famines, swiftly moving to prevent these kinds of tragedies unfolding, and this has been almost entirely ignored. And I think the fact that the supposed champion of the rule-based order is not observing the rules is hugely detrimental to the reputation of the United States, the standing of the United Nations, and the future of a world order that is based on law. And clearly, the US has some complicity here. And let me just finish with one last point on that, which is that I think people of conscience recognize this. A month ago, the provisional measure ordered in The Hague by the International Court of Justice was actually pretty strong. And I will read it, and just listen to the words here. Take all necessary and effective measures to ensure, without delay, in full cooperation with the United Nations, the unhindered provision at scale by all concerned of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance, including food, water, electricity, fuel, shelter, clothing, hygiene and sanitation requirements. It goes on. And Justice Barak, nominated to sit on the court by the Israeli government, voted in favor of that. The Israel's own former Chief Justice voted for that, making it a unanimous resolution. And why is it that the United States is not voting with Justice Barak?
Thank you, Alex. Michael, I wonder if I could ask you, just following up on what Alex just said, to also kind of think ahead. You already said that way before this cataclysmic conflict started, you were saying that our food systems are kind of embedded in violence and that they're unsustainable in humane and human rights terms. So looking ahead, again, Alex has painted this very dire picture just in terms of intergenerational transmission of trauma and physical debilitation. Do you have anything to add from the perspective of food and food as a basic human right, as a basic building block of life, of culture, of society, of family? What are you worried about when you think about the next months?
I mean, what I've been reading now, what I understand is just based on the destruction, it would take, rough estimates, it would take at least 14 years to rebuild Gaza if they stopped right now and started rebuilding. Just to give one sense of scale, but to focus more specifically on food. It's interesting in that how there's a disconnect between the world of experts and institutions that focus on famine and starvation when you compare it to the world of activists, experts, and institutions that focus on the right to food. And there's this distinction that happens in practice and conceptually as well, which assumes that famine and starvation are the exception. And I think actually that's not the case. I think it's a spectrum. I think it's a range. And most people in the world experience conflict in their lifetime. Most people in the world experience violence through their food systems. And that disconnect has been part of the problem of how to deal with these issues. And to see these structural issues and then these moments of the most acute moments of violence and horror as part of the same problem. That's sort of the big picture. I take a slightly different take on sort of the role of international law. While I agree, Israel has basically interpreted international law in this way, which is it's refused to comply with most of the basic tenets of international law, and it's done so explicitly and has done so in practice. But then I've been paying attention to how Israel justifies its actions when it does use legal terms. And it's basically an extension of the war on terror, the logic that came out of 9/11, and where there's a justification of violence and horror and atrocity in terms of necessity, military necessity, emergency necessity, vague terms like terrorism, and the way Israel frames people in Gaza. And we heard this. I'm not saying Georgios said this. I'm sort of interpreting from the facts we heard from Georgios. The way Israel is acting and justifying its actions is it treats everything as dual purpose, both civilian and military, which in the laws of wars means, then it means you can destroy it. So schools, hospitals, housing, everything is a human shield. And all people in Gaza are assumed to be terrorists unless proven otherwise. This is the logic. So it's not international law. It's a rule-based order where it's the rule of the most vicious and powerful. This is what's at stake if we pull out in terms of global governance and international law. What's also interesting to me is the United States. If you look at the United States' arguments in previous conflicts, Iraq, Libya, they still would use international legal arguments within sort of the boundaries. International law has this ambiguity. But in this case, it's almost like the United States it uses these obtuse arguments, or it's almost exited international law. This is what's unique. Even in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib in Iraq, the U.S. still justified its actions with lawyers and legal justification and justified torture. Granted, it was problematic. But in this case, there's just no more justification. The way international law works, however, is it's been part of the problem. International law and international institutions has allowed the state of Israel to be an occupying power for 75 years and has allowed, so before we get into what are the duties of an occupying force, it's allowed for occupation. And the way international humanitarian and the law works and the laws of war works, you're allowed to starve armed combatants. You are allowed to starve armed combatants. So that assumes that the food chain, the food supply chains for your military and your humanitarian relief and your civilian population are separable, which is never the instance. So international humanitarian law itself has ambiguity and has interpretive wiggle room that allows Israel to say, we're just starving armed combatants. And it's military necessity. These are all legal arguments they're allowed to make. So I think this is the point I've been making in my presentations to all UN spaces. How every UN organization responds to the war in Gaza will determine the future of the UN itself and international law itself. That's what's at stake here. And who has the most at stake, of course, are the Palestinian people. So the flip side is true as well. The tools that will liberate the Palestinian people from occupation, oppression, and exploitation, and the tools that will ensure that the Palestinian people have their right to food is fully realized, will be the same tools that will transform the international system writ large. That's truly what's at stake. So the international system has had its problems and cracks and fissures here and there. Gaza finally shows us the system broke. It's not breaking and it is not going to break. The system is fundamentally broken. This is why we've seen mass mobilization in the millions across the entire world, across generations, in ways we've never seen, not just for the Palestinian people, but on any issue. This is what's at stake. So when institutions and governments and universities hem and haw and make all their apologies, they're apologizing for genocide, they're apologizing for starvation, they're apologists for a system that has created a horror in our time, and they've already lost. That they don't. They're clinging onto the rubble of the system itself.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from the audience. So I wondered if, and Georgios, it would be wonderful to see you, but if your internet is unstable, we'd rather hear you than see you if it's a choice between those two. So let me start. Actually, a couple of the questions really go to the points that Michael was just making about protests and protest movements. Let me ask the first question that we got, which is, one of our listeners says, I'd be very interested in knowing what impact on US policies that support Israel's actions in Gaza might occur if someone like Samantha Power were to resign in protest. So does anybody want to jump in? I mean, that's a very concrete question. Would that have an impact? Is that the kind of thing that we're looking for? Is that the kind of demand one should be making? Alex, you're nodding.
If I may just make one point, which is that this administration has many senior people in it who have made the never again argument very passionately. And they are biting their tongues on this. And I think it is it's remarkable how few senior people have felt the pangs of conscience sufficiently strongly to put their jobs on the line. I don't think it speaks well for them.
Though, in fairness, didn't Samantha Power actually call out the fact that this was starvation? Would you say she was biting her tongue there? I mean, don't want to get into too much detail just on her, but
she did call it famine, which was technically correct. And but that's a factual statement rather than a moral judgment on what the administration is doing.
Georgios, I wonder if I could ask you this. I think this is a question that you might be best positioned to answer, but any of the three of you might, which is what parties will be instrumental in negotiating a ceasefire and some sort of long-term pathway to peace? Will the Saudis and other Arab countries be central here? And what about internal Israeli politics with the approximately 700,000 settlers backing the Netanyahu administration? But just take the first part of that question, really, about who are the parties who are going to be instrumental in negotiating a ceasefire, some sort of long-term pathway to peace?
Yeah, thank you. I think the negotiations, as we all know, are already underway. They are happening. Obviously, the two main parties, the most important two, are going to be Israel and Hamas. There's a part for obviously the United States. There's a part for the United Nations. Regional countries are also part of this. They come in and out. And there's, I think, a very important dynamic here between Arab countries that have diplomatic relations historically with Israel, neighboring countries, or Jordan and Egypt. And I think the dynamic with countries that are newer diplomatic neighbors, let's say. I think the one dynamic that's been made very clear to me, I'm also a newcomer to Palestine and to the occupied territories, is that of course there's a very special relationship with, in the first instance, Egypt, because there's a dynamic about the possibility of Palestinians from Gaza escaping into Egypt. I remind everyone that essentially what we have here is a 2.3 million people that are the only people on the planet who are blocked from seeking refuge. Refugee status is a human right that you have the right to seek. You have the right to escape danger. If you feel you're in danger, you can go. And they cannot. And the other, of course, is Jordan, where there are millions of people who are Palestinian. There's a case of that country's population. So these are intertwined relationships, I think, very complicated. And we also see it here in the complexities that we see around the Jordan is also very much part of supply and support to the people in Gaza. We ebb and flow on the negotiations, and I can tell you that depending on where they go and how they're going today or tomorrow, we see destruction because the fencing around the negotiations for a ceasefire or final end to this war very much are reflected in the tactics in battle here, including airstrikes and rocket attacks that, of course, kill and injure people everywhere. So let's be very clear. There's two parties to this conflict. They should be the two parties that are responsible for ending this war. For me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Michael, we have a couple of questions which really follow on from the points you made about the importance of protest. And I wondered if I could just read them to you. There are two similar questions. One is, in terms of protest movements, such as the student encampments demanding universities divest in their partnerships with firms or their own initiatives that support the war. So in terms of protest movements, what other state or organizational bodies do you think could be targeted for disruption that would have similar impacts? And a related question is actually coming, I presume, from some of the encampments. And this is the question. Many of us watching you all today are on university campuses that have encampments, and we're demanding divestment from Israel as a core demand. What advice or suggestions would you have for students, faculty, and staff to help the end of suffering and genocide in Gaza? So maybe this, I think, really follows on from some of the comments you made earlier, Michael.
There we go. I'll start with the second question. Admittedly, I'm at the University of Oregon, so when I'm not doing the UN work, I'm a faculty member at the University of Oregon School of Law, and the encampment started yesterday, and I'll be speaking to the students today. And I mean, it's amazing what the student movement in the United States has really changed. I think the political calculation in the United States and internationally. I can't stress enough how powerful the student movement has been. So really the advice is the demands for universities to divest from Israel and companies complicit in genocide and starvation against the Palestinian people, I think are reasonable demands. These are not radical demands. And so I would encourage the students to be safe and also to look out for each other, but to stick to their political position and to think what tactically after the encampments, how to keep going. So basically keep doing what they're doing. And I'm drawing inspiration and looking to leadership from the students. I don't have much to say other than words of encouragement, really. I'm learning so much from the students at my own university and from universities around the world. And I know people in Gaza have been sending messages of thanks to the students in the US and around the world. It's telling, it's always the case actually that student movements tend to be ahead of the game. It's telling that it's the students who are the most precarious, who are risking their own housing, their own education, their own access to funds. I mean, this is to jobs on campus, are showing leadership, whereas university leadership across the country are often reacting by sending in police and with violent means. This is very telling of who actually knows what's going on, who is reasonable, the students, and who is radical and unreasonable is much of the university leadership. On protests in other countries and other places, to piggyback on the previous question, I think countries in the region, Arab countries and Turkey, have a specific responsibility because it's already a regional issue. If you look at Lebanon, Israel's attacks against Lebanon have been gradually increasing. And then Hezbollah is responding in kind, but the escalation is coming from Israel in Lebanon, and people in Lebanon are waiting for war. They're just waiting for it. It'll take the slightest move, and the thing will flare up most profoundly. There's already permanent damage in Lebanon to the agricultural land and displacement of rural communities in Lebanon. So it's already, and again, like I said, there's record violence in the West Bank. So it's already a regional issue that is escalating on a regional basis. Israel's strike against the Iranian embassy in Syria is also another example of regional escalation. And so what's interesting to me is Arab countries that have recently opened up economic, political, and financial ties with Israel. They have leverage to impose sanctions. This is it. The only way Israel's going to stop is through sanction. We can't ask nicely. That hasn't worked. We've tried international law. That hasn't worked. Turkey, I think, has just imposed economic sanctions, and I think it just stopped economic exports to Israel. But those countries in the region, if they're serious, they also have a history of not treating the Palestinian people well. And this continues today. So I think people in Arab countries and Turkey can continue pressuring their own governments because, again, what's at stake is everyone's human rights ultimately, but of course the Palestinian people's right to self-determination.
Thank you so much, Michael. So, unfortunately, we are out of time. So I think this has been a very useful discussion. We could, of course, explore many other topics, and I hope we will have occasion to do so in the future. For now, I'd really like to thank our three fantastic panelists who've given their time and their wisdom and their insights to us. And to you, Georgios, in the front line, we wish you that you're safe and that your colleagues are safe, and thank you for doing the work you're doing. But thank you to Alex and to Michael as well. And I'd also like to thank the Harvard Center for Middle Eastern Studies, the Religion, Conflict and Peace Initiative at the Harvard Divinity School, and the Carr Center for Human Rights at the Harvard Kennedy School, who are co-sponsors with the FXB Center of this webinar. So thank you so much. And in the chat, there is a link for those of you who would like to sign up to our Palestine Program newsletter. Thank you all again, and look forward to rejoining some other time. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.